The most dangerous secrets are never hidden in bank vaults. They are hidden inside ordinary lives that no one thinks are worth noticing. Charlotte Hayes had built her reputation on seeing what everyone else overlooked. At 34, she had become the youngest chief executive officer in the history of Hayes Global, leading thousands of employees from the top floor of a 42-story headquarters overlooking downtown Chicago. Investors admired her discipline. Competitors respected her instincts. Reporters called her one of the brightest business leaders of her generation. Yet every evening, after the final board meeting ended and the polished conference rooms emptied, she often found herself standing alone beside the towering glass windows, watching the lights below and wondering why success always seemed quieter than she had imagined as a little girl. Downstairs, where executive conversations faded into the gentle hum of ventilation systems and polished marble echoed beneath work boots instead of expensive dress shoes, Ethan Walker pushed his maintenance cart through the nearly empty lobby. At 39, he had long stopped measuring life by titles or salaries. His greatest achievement waited at home in a small suburban house where his 8-year-old daughter Lily always left one porch light, glowing, until he returned from work. Every evening, she insisted on saving him the biggest cookie from dinner dessert, believing fathers deserved rewards for working hard. Ethan never corrected her. Some beautiful beliefs deserved protecting. As he wiped fingerprints from the glass entrance doors, his phone buzzed softly. A picture of Lily appeared on the screen, smiling with 2 missing front teeth beneath messy blonde hair. "Hi, Daddy," she said cheerfully. "Do not forget tomorrow is family reading day." Ethan smiled, the tiredness leaving his face almost instantly. "I would never miss it. Promise. I promise." "Good," Lily whispered. "Because heroes always keep their promises." Ethan laughed quietly before slipping the phone into his jacket. A few minutes later, the executive elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Charlotte stepped into the lobby carrying a leather portfolio while answering one final business call. She barely noticed the maintenance worker nearby as she walked across the polished marble floor. "Move tomorrow's investor meeting to 9, she said calmly before ending the call. At that exact moment, her phone slipped from her hand, sliding several feet before stopping beside Ethan's maintenance cart. "I have it," Ethan said gently as he bent down to retrieve it. Charlotte accepted the phone with a grateful smile. "Thank you. You are welcome." The exchange should have ended there. Instead, as Ethan straightened, his old leather wallet slipped from the pocket of his work jacket and landed open against the marble floor. A single faded photograph floated free, gliding silently until it rested near Charlotte's polished shoes. Without thinking, she reached down to pick it up. The moment her eyes focused on the image, every sound inside the enormous lobby disappeared. The little girl smiling beneath a yellow raincoat with tiny blue flowers, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit beside an old wooden bridge, was unmistakably her. Charlotte's breathing slowed. Her fingers trembled almost imperceptibly. She had not seen that photograph since she was 8 years old. Her family albums had been destroyed decades earlier after a basement flood, leaving only scattered memories of a childhood that now felt like another lifetime. Yet somehow this exact photograph had survived. Ethan noticed the expression on her face and froze where he stood. For the first time in years, he looked genuinely unprepared. Neither of them spoke. The antique grandfather clock near the reception desk continued marking each passing second while the city lights shimmered beyond the towering glass walls. Charlotte slowly lifted her eyes from the faded photograph to the quiet single father standing before her. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, but inside the silent lobby, it sounded louder than any boardroom speech she had ever delivered. "Why do you have a picture of me?" Ethan looked at the photograph for a long moment before meeting her gaze, and in his calm blue eyes rested a secret that had quietly waited more than 20 years for this exact question. Charlotte continued staring at the faded photograph as though the polished marble floor beneath her had disappeared. The little girl smiling beneath the yellow raincoat was undeniably her. Every tiny detail exactly as she remembered, from the stuffed rabbit with one missing ear to the small blue flowers stitched across the hood. She slowly turned the photograph over, expecting to find a date or a photographer's mark, but the back remained blank except for faint signs that it had been handled countless times. Ethan did not reach for it. He simply stood still with both hands resting lightly on the handle of his maintenance cart, his calm expression touched by something she could not quite identify. It was not fear. It was not guilt. It looked more like the quiet sadness of a man who had always known this moment would eventually arrive. "Answer me," Charlotte said gently, her voice steady despite the storm of questions filling her mind. "How did this end up in your wallet?" Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment before looking back at her. "I will answer," he said softly, "but not in a hallway after a long day." Charlotte frowned slightly. "Then when you are ready to hear the entire story." She searched his face for any sign of deception. Years of negotiating billion-dollar agreements had taught her how to recognize arrogance, manipulation, and carefully rehearsed lies. She found none of them. Instead, she saw quiet sincerity, the kind that could not easily be practiced. Before she could ask another question, Ethan's phone vibrated inside his jacket. He glanced at the screen and smiled immediately. Charlotte noticed the photograph of a cheerful little girl lighting up the display. "Hi, sweetheart," Ethan answered warmly. "Yes, I am almost finished." A small voice laughed through the speaker loudly enough for Charlotte to hear. "Daddy, do not forget my library book." Ethan chuckled. "I already packed it in your backpack before I left. I knew you would remember." "Heroes remember important things," Ethan replied. "Now brush your teeth and listen to Grandma." The call ended with another burst of innocent laughter. Ethan carefully slipped the phone back into his pocket, and for just a second the enormous corporate lobby felt smaller, warmer, almost like home. Charlotte realized she had never seen anyone leave a board meeting smiling the way this maintenance worker smiled after speaking with his daughter. Ethan finally extended his hand, not demanding the photograph, simply waiting. Charlotte hesitated before placing it gently into his palm. He handled it with extraordinary care, sliding it back into the transparent sleeve inside his old leather wallet as though returning a treasured family heirloom. "You have carried that for a long time," Charlotte observed quietly. Ethan nodded. "A very long time. And you knew who I was?" Another pause followed. "Yes." Charlotte felt a chill move through her despite the warm lobby. "How long?" "Since my first day working here." She stared at him in disbelief. 3 years. 3 years of passing one another in elevators, hallways, and company events without a single word about the photograph. "Why did you never say anything?" Ethan looked toward the towering windows where the lights of Chicago shimmered against the evening sky. "Because some stories belong to the right moment, not the first opportunity." Charlotte stood speechless. She had built an entire career believing that timing meant market conditions, business cycles, and strategic decisions. Yet standing before this ordinary father, she began to suspect that the most important timing in life had nothing to do with business at all. As Ethan gently pushed his maintenance cart toward the service corridor, he stopped after only a few steps and quietly added, "There is one thing you should know before tomorrow. I never kept that photograph because I wanted to find you. I kept it because every time I looked at it, it reminded me of the kind of man I promised myself I would never stop becoming." Charlotte did not return to her penthouse immediately that evening. Instead, she remained alone in her office long after the lights across the executive floor had dimmed. The city stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but her attention never left the faded memories beginning to awaken inside her mind. She opened the lowest drawer of a cabinet she rarely touched and pulled out a weathered storage box filled with childhood keepsakes that had somehow survived the years. Old birthday cards, elementary school report cards, a faded friendship bracelet, and a tiny silver music box rested inside. But there was no photograph of the little girl in the yellow raincoat. The basement flood that had destroyed nearly every family album when she was a child had truly erased that piece of her past. Yet somehow Ethan had protected what even her own family had lost. The following morning, Charlotte arrived at Hayes Global before sunrise. She canceled her first meeting, something she almost never did, and quietly asked the director of human resources to bring her Ethan Walker's employee file. The folder arrived within minutes. She expected hidden connections, unexplained addresses, suspicious behavior, or some forgotten link between their families. Instead, she discovered an almost painfully ordinary life. Ethan had worked for the company just over 3 years. Every performance review described him with nearly identical words: dependable, respectful, honest, consistently helpful, never late, never complained. One handwritten note from a department manager thanked him for staying after his shift to repair a broken wheelchair belonging to a visiting client. Another praised him for returning an expensive watch without expecting recognition. A third described how he had comforted a frightened child who had become separated from his parents during a company event. Charlotte slowly closed the file. Nothing suggested obsession. Nothing suggested manipulation. Every page reflected quiet character. Still unsettled, she contacted the head of corporate security. "Has Ethan Walker ever violated company policy?" she asked. The answer came without hesitation. "Never. Honestly, Miss Hayes, he is one of the most trusted people in the building. If every employee carried themselves the way he does, my department would barely have any work." Charlotte thanked him and ended the call, but the mystery only deepened. Late that afternoon, she walked toward the employee cafeteria without telling anyone where she was going. Through the glass doors, she noticed Ethan sitting alone during his break. His lunch consisted of a homemade turkey sandwich, an apple, and a reusable water bottle. Beside his meal rested a small box of colored pencils and a folded sheet of white paper. Curious, Charlotte watched from a respectful distance as Ethan carefully colored the edges of a castle drawn in bright crayons. Across the top, written in uneven childish letters, were the words, "Thank you for always coming home, Daddy." Ethan smiled quietly to himself before folding the drawing with remarkable care and slipping it into his lunch bag as though it were more valuable than anything money could buy. Charlotte felt something shift inside her heart. She had spent years surrounded by million-dollar contracts, luxury offices, and ambitious conversations. Yet the richest moment she had witnessed all week involved a father protecting a simple drawing made by his daughter. As Ethan stood and returned his lunch container to his bag, he looked through the cafeteria window for just a brief second. Their eyes met across the room. He did not look embarrassed. He did not look defensive. He simply offered a small, genuine smile before returning to work, leaving Charlotte with one undeniable realization. Whatever secret connected them, it had never stolen his peace. Somehow it had become the very reason he carried it with quiet gratitude every single day. Friday evening arrived wrapped in a gentle spring rain that painted the streets of Chicago with shimmering reflections. As Charlotte stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows outside the executive conference room, tiny drops traced slow paths across the glass, and something deep inside her stirred without warning. It was not a complete memory. It was only a feeling. The scent of wet pine trees, the cool touch of damp air against her cheeks, the distant sound of water moving beneath old wooden boards. She closed her eyes for only a moment, and suddenly she could almost hear a familiar voice saying, "Storms never last forever." Her heart skipped. When she opened her eyes again, the memory disappeared as quickly as it had come. Later, that evening, after the final employees had gone home, Charlotte walked through the quiet lobby, hoping she might find Ethan. She discovered him near the service entrance repairing the loose wheel on his maintenance cart with a small wrench from an old toolbox. Every movement was careful and patient, as though even the smallest object deserved respect instead of replacement. Charlotte approached quietly. "You could ask the company to buy you a new cart," she said. Ethan smiled without looking up. "This one still has plenty of good years left. You always fix things instead of replacing them." Ethan tightened the final bolt before standing upright. "Most things deserve another chance before people give up on them." His answer lingered in the air long after the words faded. Charlotte found herself wondering whether he was speaking about equipment or about life itself. Outside, the rain continued falling softly against the glass doors. She glanced toward the dark parking lot before asking the question that had been growing inside her all week. "Do you remember exactly where that photograph was taken?" Ethan followed her gaze toward the rain. His calm expression softened. "Every detail." Charlotte looked back at him. "I only remember pieces." Ethan nodded slowly. "Sometimes memories return the same way sunrise arrives. Not all at once. Just enough light for the next step." Charlotte studied his face. "Were you really there?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and checked a message that had just appeared on his phone. A photograph filled the screen showing Lily proudly holding a library book with an enormous smile. Beneath the picture she had written, "I cannot wait for tomorrow, Daddy." Ethan smiled with quiet pride before slipping the phone away again. Charlotte noticed how quickly the tiredness disappeared from his face whenever his daughter entered his thoughts. Yes, he finally answered. I was there. The words settled between them like the gentle rain outside. Charlotte felt another forgotten image rise unexpectedly inside her mind. A little girl standing beneath a yellow raincoat. A stuffed rabbit pressed tightly against her chest. A warm brown jacket being placed carefully around her shoulders. She still could not see the face of the young man beside her, but she remembered feeling completely safe. I remember someone telling me not to be afraid, she whispered almost to herself. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before looking back at her. Fear becomes much smaller when someone chooses to stand beside you. Charlotte felt tears gathering without understanding why. She had spent decades believing that memory belonged only to childhood imagination. Now it felt undeniably real. Ethan gently placed the wrench back into his toolbox and rested both hands on the maintenance cart once more. There is still one part you cannot remember, he said quietly. It is the part that explains why your father placed that photograph in my hands before your family drove away, and why I promised myself I would never lose it for as long as I lived. Charlotte barely noticed the passing of the weekend. Meetings, reports, and endless messages continued arriving as they always had. Yet her thoughts repeatedly returned to one quiet sentence Ethan had spoken beneath the sound of falling rain. Some memories return the same way sunrise arrives. Not all at once. By Monday morning, she realized she was no longer trying to solve a mystery. She was trying to understand a man whose life refused to fit inside ordinary assumptions. That afternoon, after another executive meeting concluded, Charlotte deliberately chose a different route through the building instead of taking the private elevator. As she crossed the employee courtyard behind the headquarters, she noticed a small gathering near the entrance. A delivery driver had accidentally dropped several boxes of school supplies across the sidewalk. Before anyone else reacted, Ethan quietly knelt beside the scattered notebooks and crayons, carefully gathering everything one piece at a time. Several employees hurried past, distracted by schedules and phone calls, but Ethan smiled as he handed a colorful box of crayons to a little girl waiting beside her mother. The child beamed with excitement, as though she had been given something priceless. Ethan simply wished her a wonderful day before returning to his work without expecting thanks. Charlotte remained several yards away, watching the scene unfold. No one applauded. No manager observed the moment. There would be no recognition in the company newsletter. Yet Ethan behaved exactly the same way he had behaved every day since she first noticed him. Kindness was not something he performed. It had become part of who he was. As the afternoon faded into evening, Charlotte found herself walking toward the maintenance hallway once again. She discovered Ethan organizing supplies inside a small storage room while softly humming an old melody. You always seem peaceful, she said. Ethan looked up with a gentle smile. Not always. Then why does it look that way? He considered the question before answering. Because peace is usually a choice you make long before life becomes difficult. Charlotte leaned lightly against the doorway, allowing his words to settle. Did carrying that photograph really help you through everything? Ethan reached into his jacket and held the worn wallet for a brief moment without opening it. Every single day. Charlotte looked at him with quiet curiosity. Even after your wife passed away? Ethan's expression softened, but no bitterness appeared in his eyes. Especially then. He looked toward a small drawing Lily had taped inside his locker several months earlier. It showed a bright yellow sun above two smiling stick figures holding hands. There were mornings when I wondered how I would raise Lily by myself. Then I would read the words your father once wrote to me. They reminded me that children remember kindness much longer than success. Charlotte felt her throat tighten. Her father had been gone for years, yet his encouragement had continued shaping another family long after his own life had ended. You never blamed life for becoming difficult? She asked quietly. Ethan smiled with the same calm humility she had come to recognize. Life owes us very little, but every new morning gives us another chance to become the person we hoped to be yesterday. Charlotte lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by the simplicity of his wisdom. She had spent years searching for extraordinary leadership inside books, seminars, and boardrooms without realizing she had been walking past it almost every evening in the company hallway. As Ethan prepared to leave for family reading day with Lily the following morning, he carefully slipped the old wallet back into his jacket. Charlotte noticed him gently touch it once before turning toward the door. It was not the photograph he was protecting anymore. It was the promise attached to it. A promise that had quietly transformed a frightened little girl's forgotten afternoon into a lifetime of grace that neither of them had fully understood until now. The next evening, Charlotte asked Ethan to meet her in the quiet company courtyard after his shift ended. The city lights shimmered beyond the trees, and a cool spring breeze carried the faint scent of fresh rain through the air. For the first time since finding the photograph, neither of them seemed rushed. Charlotte held 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Ethan with a grateful smile. "Thank you," he said softly. They sat on a wooden bench overlooking a small fountain whose gentle water echoed through the peaceful courtyard. After several moments of comfortable silence, Charlotte looked at him and quietly asked, "I think I am finally ready. Will you tell me everything?" Ethan rested the warm cup between his hands before reaching into his jacket. He removed the familiar wallet and carefully unfolded the faded photograph one more time. Behind it rested another piece of paper, carefully preserved inside a protective sleeve. "This is a copy," he explained. "The original became too fragile years ago, so I copied every word before time erased it." Charlotte accepted the page with trembling hands. The handwriting instantly brought tears to her eyes. It belonged to her father. She could recognize every careful stroke without hesitation. She slowly read the message aloud. "Dear Ethan, thank you for staying with our little girl today. She may forget this rainy afternoon one day, but I hope she never forgets that the world is still full of good people. Please promise me that you will never stop being one of them." Charlotte could not continue. Her voice broke as memories she thought were lost forever finally returned with complete clarity. She remembered sitting beneath the old wooden bridge while rain tapped gently against her yellow hood. She remembered crying over a balloon that had floated away. She remembered a kind young man wrapping his brown jacket around her shoulders and telling her that every storm eventually ran out of rain. Most of all, she remembered her father smiling as he handed that young man the freshly developed photograph several weeks later, saying, "Keep this, son. One day both of you may need to remember that kindness matters." Tears slipped quietly down Charlotte's face. Ethan looked toward the fountain before speaking again. "Your father believed those words would encourage a young man starting his adult life. He was right. Every difficult season I faced, I opened my wallet and remembered his promise. When my wife became ill, I remembered it. When I found myself raising Lily alone, I remembered it. When life felt uncertain, I remembered that one family believed I could become someone worth trusting." Charlotte lowered the letter and looked at Ethan with overwhelming gratitude. "My father changed your life." Ethan smiled gently. "Yes, but he never knew that years later his daughter would unknowingly change it again just by reminding me of the promise I made that day." Charlotte reached over and carefully placed the copied letter back into Ethan's hands. "No," she whispered. "You kept the promise. That was your choice." Ethan quietly folded the paper and returned it behind the photograph inside his wallet. "Perhaps," he answered. "But sometimes one kind sentence becomes the foundation another person builds an entire life upon." They sat together in peaceful silence as the fountain continued flowing beside them. Charlotte realized that the greatest investment her father had ever made was not financial, and the greatest inheritance he had left behind was not stored inside a bank account. It lived inside the heart of an ordinary single father who had quietly carried one photograph, one promise, and one lesson for more than 20 years, proving that the smallest act of kindness could become a legacy powerful enough to change 2 families across an entire lifetime. The days that followed felt different for Charlotte in ways no financial report could ever measure. She still walked through the same executive offices, chaired the same meetings, and signed the same contracts. But every decision now carried a quieter question inside her heart. Would this leave people better than she found them? That single thought had become the invisible thread connecting her father's words, Ethan's life, and her own future. One Wednesday afternoon, she stood outside the employee childcare center that Hayes Global sponsored for working families. She had rarely visited before, yet something drew her there. Through the large glass windows, she saw Ethan sitting cross-legged on a colorful reading rug surrounded by a small group of children, including Lily. Family reading day had become one of his favorite traditions. He held an old hardcover storybook open across his lap while every child listened with complete attention. He never rushed through the pages. He gave every character a different voice, every sentence the time it deserved, and every child the feeling that they mattered. Lily looked at her father with unmistakable admiration. Charlotte suddenly understood what true leadership looked like when no audience expected perfection. As the reading ended, one little boy approached Ethan carrying a torn picture book. "Can it be fixed?" he asked hopefully. Ethan smiled with quiet confidence. "Most things deserve a chance before we give up on them." Charlotte recognized the sentence immediately. She watched Ethan carefully repair the loose pages with clear tape before handing the book back. The child hugged it tightly as though receiving a priceless treasure. The moment seemed so ordinary that most people would have forgotten it within minutes. Charlotte knew she never would. Later that evening, she found Ethan replacing light bulbs in one of the quieter hallways. "You were right," she said as she approached him. Ethan climbed down from the small ladder and smiled politely. "About what?" "Some things really do deserve another chance." Ethan nodded gently. "People most of all." Charlotte looked down the empty hallway before speaking again. "My father believed kindness could outlive the moment it was given. I never truly understood what he meant until now." Ethan rested the new light bulb inside its box and folded the cardboard carefully before placing it into the recycling container. "Kindness has a remarkable memory," he replied. "Sometimes longer than people do." Charlotte smiled through eyes that had grown unexpectedly warm. "I have been thinking about that photograph." Ethan listened quietly. "For years I believed it survived because someone held on to the past. Now I realize it survived because someone refused to let go of a promise." Ethan's expression softened. "Promises become part of us when we honor them every day instead of only remembering them once in a while." Charlotte looked at the humble father standing beneath the hallway lights and felt something else awakening inside her. It was not admiration alone. It was respect deep enough to change the direction of her own life. Before walking away, she stopped and turned back toward him. "There is something I would like to do," she said quietly. "Not to repay you, because I know that is impossible, but to honor what my father started all those years ago." Ethan tilted his head slightly, waiting without expectation. Charlotte smiled gently. "I think the promise deserves to reach more people than just the two of us." Ethan looked at her for a long, thoughtful moment, and although he did not yet know what she intended, he recognized the same quiet determination he had once seen in the eyes of her father beneath a rainbow after the rain had finally ended. Over the next several weeks, Charlotte quietly put her idea into motion. She did not announce a new initiative with cameras or press releases. She did not schedule interviews or prepare speeches celebrating herself. Instead, she spent time walking through departments she had rarely visited before, speaking with receptionists, maintenance workers, cafeteria employees, security officers, and administrative assistants. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, she asked one simple question wherever she went. "Who is the kindest person you work with?" The answer surprised her only once. Every conversation eventually led to the same name: Ethan Walker. One security officer smiled as he recalled how Ethan always brought extra coffee during overnight shifts in the winter. A receptionist remembered the evening he stayed long after his own work was finished to help an elderly visitor find her misplaced car keys. A young accountant spoke about the day Ethan quietly repaired the wheel on her office chair without being asked because he noticed she was expecting her first child. None of those stories had ever appeared in performance reports or company newsletters. They existed only inside grateful hearts. Charlotte listened to every one of them. One afternoon, she invited Ethan to her office. He entered with the same humility he carried everywhere else, looking slightly uncomfortable beneath the elegant surroundings of polished walnut furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows. "You wanted to see me?" he asked. Charlotte smiled warmly. "Yes. Please sit down." Ethan hesitated before accepting the chair across from her desk. Charlotte folded her hands together and looked directly at him. "I have spent weeks learning something remarkable." Ethan looked puzzled. "What is that?" She gently slid a folder across the desk. Inside were handwritten thank you notes collected from employees throughout the company. Dozens of them. Some were only a few sentences long. Others filled entire pages. Every one described an ordinary act of kindness Ethan had long forgotten. He slowly turned each page in complete silence. By the time he reached the final letter, his eyes had become noticeably brighter. I do not remember doing some of these things, he admitted quietly. Charlotte smiled. That is because kindness was never an event for you. It became a habit. Ethan carefully closed the folder. I never expected anyone to notice. Charlotte gently shook her head. They noticed. They simply never knew how to thank you. Ethan looked toward the city skyline beyond the glass. If people spend too much time looking for credit, they eventually stop looking for opportunities to help. Charlotte felt the truth of those words settle deeply inside her heart. She stood and walked toward the window beside him. My father once believed one kind sentence could shape another person's future. Ethan nodded softly. He was right. Charlotte looked at the busy streets far below. I think your life has proved something even greater. Ethan waited patiently. She turned toward him with a peaceful smile. Kindness does not disappear after the moment it is given. It quietly travels from one heart to another until nobody can remember where it first began. Ethan lowered his eyes, humbled by the thought. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The late afternoon sunlight poured through the windows, filling the office with a warm golden glow that felt strangely familiar. Charlotte suddenly realized she was standing in almost the same light that had once broken through the rain clouds above the old wooden bridge. Different place, different season, the same lesson. Some promises were never meant to stay inside a wallet forever. They were meant to become a way of living that others would one day carry forward without even realizing where the journey had first begun. Several months later, the annual Hayes Global Employee Gathering filled the largest auditorium in the building. Hundreds of people took their seats expecting the usual presentations about growth, future investments, and business achievements. The stage was prepared with elegant simplicity. Warm golden lights illuminated the room, and the Chicago skyline shimmered beyond the tall windows as evening slowly settled across the city. Ethan stood quietly near the back beside the facilities team, believing he would simply applaud the speeches before heading home to read another bedtime story to Lily. Charlotte stepped onto the stage carrying no financial reports and no presentation remote. She paused for a long moment before looking across the audience with a calm smile. Tonight, she began, I am not going to speak about profit, expansion, or market leadership. I want to speak about the kind of success that cannot be measured on any balance sheet. The room became completely silent. Charlotte continued with quiet confidence. Over the past several weeks, I asked employees throughout this company one simple question. I asked them to tell me about the kindest person they had ever worked beside. Different departments, different careers, different backgrounds. Yet the same name appeared again and again. Ethan lowered his eyes, never imagining where the story was leading. Charlotte gently lifted the worn childhood photograph for everyone to see. Many years ago, when I was only a little girl, one ordinary act of kindness became the foundation for a promise that quietly changed two families. That promise has continued living inside this company every single day through someone who never asked for recognition. She looked toward the back of the auditorium. Ethan, would you please join me? Hundreds of heads turned as Ethan slowly walked toward the stage with visible humility. The applause began softly before growing into a heartfelt standing ovation that seemed to continue without end. Ethan looked almost uncomfortable beneath the attention, yet he smiled with the same gentle gratitude that had always defined him. When he reached the stage, Charlotte handed him a handcrafted wooden frame. Inside rested the restored childhood photograph beside the carefully preserved original copy, along with a small engraved plaque that read, "Kindness remembered becomes kindness repeated." Ethan studied the frame without speaking, his eyes filled with quiet emotion. "This belongs to both of us now," Charlotte said softly, "because the promise belongs to everyone willing to keep it alive." Ethan looked toward the audience before answering. "I never believed one small moment could travel this far." Charlotte smiled warmly. "Neither did my father. But he believed good people would carry it forward, and he was right." The audience remained standing, not because they had witnessed an extraordinary achievement, but because they had been reminded of an extraordinary truth. Long after titles disappear, careers end, and buildings are replaced, character remains. Later that evening, Ethan returned home, where Lily ran into his arms the moment he opened the front door. She noticed the wooden frame and smiled. "Is that the picture you always keep in your wallet?" Ethan nodded. "Yes." Lily looked at him with innocent curiosity. "Does it still remind you to be kind?" Ethan gently kissed the top of her head. Every single day, Lily smiled and slipped her small hand into his. Together, they placed the frame on a shelf beside family photographs, leaving the original picture safely inside Ethan's old leather wallet exactly where it had remained for more than 20 years. Some memories belong on display, but some promises belong close to the heart, quietly guiding every ordinary choice until one life of grace becomes the beginning of countless others.